By show of hands, how many of you have ever lived somewhere other than your hometown? Anybody ever lived somewhere other than your hometown? Yeah. For those of you who have, do you remember the feeling you had the first time you came back home? Remember that? Do you remember how it felt to come back and the emotions you experienced as you came back? I went to college about 2.5 hours from where I grew up. We grew up near Athens, Georgia. I went to college in South Carolina. And I remember the feeling of coming back home for the first time. Now, I'd only been away for a couple of weeks. It wasn't like years had gone by. It was just like 2 weeks. But as I drove the same familiar roads and passed by the same familiar places and trees and buildings, it was as if everything had changed. And so I think about my experience returning home in college, and I wonder what it must have been like for Naomi to come home. See, last week we saw, as we began to study the book of Ruth, that Naomi and her husband and 2 sons had moved away from their hometown to Moab. And this was a surprising decision to make because Moab was not real friendly with the people of Israel. They were their enemy. But there had been a famine in their hometown. They had to do what they had to do to survive. And so while they were there in Moab, their sons married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. We saw that tragedy struck the family. Naomi's husband and both sons ended up dying. And so her daughters-in-law were left as widows. She was left destitute. And so after 10 years of living in Moab, after all of her life's tragedies, Naomi decides to go home. And today we're going to look at Naomi's journey home. We're going to look at the surprising sidekick she brings along with her. And then we're going to look at 3 themes that kind of pervade this story and teach us about our God. So if you would, Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to go to your people." So Naomi hears here that God has brought food back to Bethlehem. And after 10 years of living in Moab, she picks up to go home. And Ruth and Orpah, her Moabite daughters-in-law, decide to come along with her, which is very kind. But they get a certain way along the road, and eventually Naomi just stops, and she says, "Look, you 2 should just go home." She says, "You've been so kind to me. I pray God would be that kind to you. Now just go back home to Moab. Go get remarried. Live happy, peaceful lives." Naomi's releasing them of any responsibility or commitment they had to her. And Ruth and Orpah are like, "No, we're going to go back with you. We're going home with you." But Naomi has none of it. She continues, verse 11. Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Naomi asks them a couple questions for them to see how foolish it would be for them to follow her. She says, "Look, first, you got your first husbands from me. Am I going to have any more sons?" The obvious answer at that point was no. She says, look, even if I did have more sons, were you going to wait around 18, 20 years for them to be old enough for you to marry? The obvious answer is no. So Naomi's like, look, I have a bitter life ahead of me. You don't want to follow me. It's going to be hard. Just go back home to Moab. So Orpah and Ruth, they make their decisions. Verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. But Ruth clung to her. Orpah here makes the sensible choice, right? She decides to go back home. It made the most sense. But Ruth made the extraordinary choice. Ruth decided to stay with Naomi. And Ruth follows up this extraordinary decision with some of the most beautiful words in all of Scripture. Look at verse 15. After Ruth clings to her, she says, Naomi says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. She says, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Isn't that a beautiful statement? A beautiful passage? Maybe you have that passage painted on some wall art, or you've heard it recited at a wedding, or you have it etched in your heart. Ruth says, look, it doesn't matter where you go. I'm going with you. She says, it doesn't matter where you stay. I'm staying with you. It doesn't matter where you die. I'll be buried alongside you. And nestled in the middle there, she says, look, it doesn't matter what God you worship or what people you call your own. Your God will be my God. And your people will become my people. And we'll dig into these words more in just a minute. But Ruth is giving up everything to serve her mother-in-law. Now I have a wonderful mother-in-law. But I wager most people do not have this level of commitment to their in-laws. Right? You generally joke about your in-laws. You don't commit to leaving everything and following them. It's not normal, but that's exactly what Ruth does. She goes and devotes herself to her mother-in-law. And so these two widows stroll into Bethlehem. Finally, after a long journey, Naomi's home. The town is abuzz, verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. The women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, the Lord's brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So they get back, and everybody's like, Naomi's back in town, and we get a glimpse of maybe how Naomi felt when she returned. In her eyes, everything had changed since she'd left. And not in a good way. She'd left with a family. She'd come back empty. In this culture, names were meaningful. You didn't just name someone because it sounded pretty. And names were supposed to reflect truthfully on your experience. And Naomi's name meant literally lovely. She didn't feel lovely anymore. So she tells them, look, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. She says, my life is bitter at this point. But no matter how they got there, Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem. And in the coming chapters and in coming messages, we're going to see how God takes Naomi's bitter situation and makes something sweet out of it. So we've looked at this story and what happens here, but this is not just a simple story about a road trip. This is not just a simple story about two ladies going from one town to another. There is more going on here under the surface. And so what we're going to do with the rest of this time, we're going to zoom in on three key themes that are present in this passage. And they're represented by three words in this passage. And the first word is the word return. Return. As I read these verses, you may have heard me say the word return again and again and again and again. And you'd be right. The word return is in everywhere in this passage. I've circled all the references of it, and it's like circle, 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 circle. But the presence of this word is even a little more obvious in the original language the text was written in the Hebrew. Now, for those who don't know, the Bible was originally written not in English, but in other languages. The Old Testament was mostly written in Hebrew. The New Testament was mostly written in Greek. And I normally don't go and dig into the Hebrew and Greek up here because it gets technical really fast and it's easy to get lost. But I'm going to make an exception today, all right? I hope you'll indulge me to let me talk about some Hebrew and Greek for one day. Because there is so much meaning packed into the Hebrew words in this passage. See, the Hebrew word for return is the word shub. And shub is translated a variety of ways here as return, but also when you go back and read it, when it says go back, or when it says turn back. And all in all, this word shub is used 10 times, in just about 16 verses. And this was very intentional, because when this text was first written, not everybody could read back then. Most people would encounter this text by hearing it read to them, maybe by memorizing it. And when they listened, as someone read the story to them and they listened, they would hear the word return again and again and again. And it would get them fixated on this idea that this passage is about a return. Movies do this kind of the same way. There's a movie Kay and I like. And there's a plot twist at the end that deals with time. The very end, there's a plot twist about time travel. But before the plot twist is ever revealed, the director drops little hints all throughout the movie to let you know this movie is about time. Early in the movie, the camera fixates on a clock. It doesn't make any sense then. Later, a clock tower. And there's clocks all throughout, and it's intentional. The director is giving you a clue. He's dropping hints. This movie is about time. And in this passage, the author's doing the same thing, not with pictures, but with words. He's giving us a clue. He's dropping little hints. The story is about a return. And so the question is, what return does he want us to think about? The most obvious return is Naomi's physical return to Bethlehem. Right? She is literally returning from Moab to Bethlehem. But the greatest return in this passage isn't physical at all. It's spiritual. It's Ruth's spiritual return to God. Remember, Ruth grew up in Moab. Ruth grew up worshiping a false god. Ruth grew up outside the people of God. But when Ruth went with Naomi, she decided to leave all that behind. In that beautiful section of commitment, Ruth tells Naomi, she says, "Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." So Ruth chose to return physically, yes, but God used this physical return as a means by which, and kind of a spur by which she would spiritually return to Him. Ruth was turning to the one true God. When you think about this, this is the kind of situation for all of us. All of us are like Ruth, needing to return to God. So God created human beings for fellowship and for relationship with Him. But every single one of us on our own goes our own way. Every single one of us on our own drifts off into our own little Moabs, where we worship other things, where we live lives that don't please God. But all along, God beckons us to return. He knew the journey was too long for us, the path too impossible for us to get back to Him, so He bought our ticket. He sent Jesus to live and to die in our place so we could have forgiveness of sins, we could have our pathway paid. And now, we all have a chance to return to God. We have a chance to return to His people. So let me ask you this morning, where are you in this walk with God? Are you still living your life out in your Moabs? Are you still devoting your life to false gods and things that won't fulfill? Are you still out there indulging in actions or thoughts or attitudes or speech that do not honor God? Because God is beckoning you to return, just like Ruth did. To return to Him, to return to His people. Well, the first thing here we see is that God beckons us to return. The second word we want to focus on is the word cling. The word cling. Verse 14. We see here it says, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. Right? Orpah decided to go home. But Ruth clung to her. The word clung here, the original word for the word clung, has connotations for this firm kind of loyalty, a deep affection. It involves leaving one thing, turning around and holding fast to another. It's kind of like in a wedding, right? In a wedding, the bride and groom, they leave their own families and they hold fast to one another. And on one level, we see that that's what Ruth did to Naomi. Ruth clung to Naomi. Naomi had released Ruth of her commitment to her. Naomi had said, look, you can go on home, but Ruth stuck with her anyway. And this wasn't just one of those commitments that we often make, like, you know, like, I'll be there for you. Or let me know if you need anything, one of those things. Now, Ruth committed to going and living and being buried alongside Naomi. So Ruth clung to Naomi, but under the surface, there's another clinging going on. Ruth also clung to God. Ruth renounced her religious roots, and she clung to Naomi's faith. Ruth renounced her people, and she clung to the people of God. Ruth renounced her past, and she clung to her new future in a new land. She renounced everything, all of her past, so she could cling to God. And Naomi tried to persuade her out of it. She said, look, Ruth, this is going to be hard. But when Ruth was faced with the decision between staying in Moab and having everything but no God, or going to Bethlehem and having God but nothing else, Ruth chose Bethlehem. She chose God. She let go of her past and she clung to God. And so again for us, do you have that kind of faith that Ruth did? Have you let go of the things you used to cling to? And have you clung exclusively to God? So often we think when we come to God, we can kind of keep our hands in both worlds. We can keep all our past too. That we can have God and that old sin habit. We can have God and the idols that want to take priority in our lives. We can have God in our Moab. That's not the way it works. Ruth couldn't have her new God and her old one. She had to let one go and cling to another. Same is true for us. When we cling to God, we got to let go of everything else that would vie for His attention. We let go of those sin habits. We let go of those idols, and it can be hard. But are you willing, like Ruth, to follow God, even if it would cost you everything? Are you willing to follow God, even if it meant the road would get more difficult, not less? That's what Ruth did. That's what it means to cling to God. The third word we're going to look at today is in verse 8. And it's the word, well, it's actually two words in our English, deal kindly. Naomi in this verse praises Ruth and Orpah for dealing kindly with her. And she prays, she says, look, I pray God would deal kindly with you too. But if we were to read this in its original language, the word here for deal kindly is the word chesed. Now, chesed is kind of hard. First, it's hard to say. It sounds kind of funny, right? It sounds like I'm talking Klingon or something. But it's also extremely hard to translate into English. Chesed conveys a whole lot of ideas. Love and mercy and grace and kindness. Hesed is the kind of love where you do something for someone else even if it doesn't benefit you. Hesed is the kind of love that when you make a promise to someone, you'll never ever break it. No matter how much the other person lets you down. If we could boil it all down, Hesed is like this lavish, loyal love. And it's the Old Testament's favorite term, above all, to describe God's love for humanity and God's love for His people. There's a lot of ways to think about this love, but one way to think about it, this week, some of you were at Donnie Aycock's memorial service on Thursday. And there, his son Jason told a story that I think characterizes what this kind of love looks like. Jason says that he had a handshake agreement with another guy to buy a bottle-fed twin cow. Now, I don't know much about cows or anything, so I can't tell you whether this is a good deal or not. But he thought he had a great deal to buy this cow. And he went home and he talked it over with Donnie. And after a little while talking, Donnie's like, look, this is probably not a good idea. This is not a good deal. I wouldn't do this if I were you. Jason says, okay, look, I'm not going to buy it. And Jason's about to leave. But Donnie says, wait, hold on a minute. And he asks him, he said, did you tell the man you were going to buy it from him? And Jason says, yeah. Donnie says, you should keep your word. So Jason said, okay. Jason went and bought the cow. It wasn't ideal. It evidently was not a good deal. But he did it because he told the man he was going to do it. And that idea of keeping your promises to someone, that gives us a little glimpse into what kind of love this is talking about. What kind of faithful love that God has for us. I'm sure there are a lot of times when it would make a lot of sense for God to back out of His arrangement with us. He'd look at His people and say, this is not what I bargained for, right? Because we are far bigger letdowns than some bottle-fed twin cows. But God has made a promise to His people, and He will keep it. And this idea of loving something, keeping your promises, is wrapped up in this kind of love that we're talking about here. It's not just love, it's a lavish, loyal, faithful love that keeps its promises. In this verse, Naomi says, look, that's the kind of love you've shown me. You've been lavishly loyal to me. You've sacrificed for me when it didn't benefit you a bit. You're even willing to come with me to Bethlehem. She says, I pray God would show this kind of lavish, loyal love to you too. And the truth is that He is. The rest of the story, that's exactly what He's going to do. And the reality is that God's lavishly loyal love undergirds this entire story and all of the Bible. Because years prior, God had made a promise to a little lowly shepherd named Abram. And He said, look, from you, I'm going to make a great nation. I'm going to bless you, on and on and on. God made a covenant, a promise with Abraham and his descendants, and because of His loyal, faithful, lavish love, He's going to do it. And we see that in this story. God was lavishly loyal and faithful the entire time. It was God who took care of Naomi and her family for all those years. It was God who brought food and provision back to Bethlehem. It was God who guided Naomi and Ruth on their journey back home. And if you know the rest of the story, it would be God who'd arrange the details whereby Ruth could meet Boaz. It would be God who'd work out the situation so Ruth could marry Boaz. And it would be God who would see fit to provide children to this family and to bring about ultimately a king for Israel and eventually a king for all the universe. God's faithful, loyal love undergirds this whole passage. It undergirds all of human history. Maybe you're thinking, thank you for the lesson on history, but what does this have to do with me? The answer is, it has everything to do with you. Because when you turn from your sins and trust in Jesus, right? When you return to the God who made you, when you cling to Him, God grafts you into this people He's been building throughout all history. He brings you out of darkness. He brings you into the spiritual family. Today we call it the church. And it means when you trust in Jesus, God has this kind of lavish, loyal love for you. You are a part of His treasured people. You are the one, part of those people that He's loved for years and years and years. In the good times and the bad. In the times of abundance and the times we don't have anything. He is lavishly loyal to you. He will never ever let you go. He will never ever give up on you. He will never ever forget you or neglect you. He will be lavishly loyal to His people forever. And you think about that. You think about how we're like those stubborn, bottle-fed cows. We don't deserve that kind of love. So when you feel down, remember that kind of love God has for you. When you feel worried, remember that God has that kind of love for you. When you feel fearful, or when you feel like a failure, when you don't know how you can keep going on, remember God's lavish, loyal love for His people and for you. See, Naomi and Ruth journeyed back to Bethlehem, but it wasn't just a road trip. Their trip was a journey, an opportunity to see God very clearly at work in their lives. And very clearly at work in ours. Because the same God who guided these two widows beckons us to return to Him. He beckons us to cling to Him. And He does this all not because we deserve it, but because of His always faithful, never-ending, constant, sacrificial love for you and for me. Would you pray with me? God, I don't know how You're speaking to each of us this morning. Perhaps You're calling some of us to return to You, God. We've been off drifting in Moabs, off living lives for ourselves, not for You. I pray if there's anyone here who needs to return, You bring them back to You. God, perhaps there's some here who are trying to have a hand in both worlds. Who are trying to cling to You but still holding on to their past or their sins or their idols or the things that they want more than You. God, help them to see they got to pick. If there's anyone here who's dealing with that, help them to turn to You and embrace You wholeheartedly. And God, above all, remind us of Your love. The love that You have for Your people. The love that we don't deserve. The love that we could never earn. But the promise-keeping, faithful, eternal love You have for us. I pray that would be an encouragement to us this morning. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.